strong buoy, strengthened by a couple of spars, was thrown into the ocean. The end of the rope was carefully lashed to it, and left solely to the rise and fall of the billows. The buoy would not sensibly deviate from the spot. At this moment, the engineer sent to inform the captain that steam was up and they could start, for which agreeable communication the captain thanked him. The course was then given north-northeast, and the corvette, Waring, steered at full steam direct for San Francisco. It was 3 in the morning. 450 miles to cross. It was nothing for a good vessel like the Susquehanna. In 36 hours, she had covered that distance, and on the 14th of December, at 27 minutes past 1 at night, she entered the Bay of San Francisco. At the sight of a ship of the National Navy arriving at full speed, with her bowsprit broken, public curiosity was greatly roused. A dense crowd soon assembled on the quay, waiting for them to disembark. After casting anchor, Captain Blomsberry and Lieutenant Bronsfield entered an 8-paired cutter, which soon brought them to land. They jumped on to the quay. The telegraph, they asked, without answering one of the 1,000 questions addressed to them. The officer of the port conducted them to the telegraph office through a concourse of spectators. Blomsberry and Bronsfield entered, while the crowd crushed each other at the door. Some minutes later, a 4-fold telegram was sent out, the first to the Naval Secretary at Washington, the second to the Vice President of the Gun Club, Baltimore, the third to the Hun, J.T. Maston, Long's Peak, Rocky Mountains, and the fourth to the Subdirector of the Cambridge Observatory, Massachusetts. It was worded as follows: in 20 degrees 7 north latitude and degrees 37 west longitude, on the 12th of December, at 17 minutes past 1 in the morning, the projectile of the Columbiad fell into the Pacific. Send instructions. Blomsberry, Commander Susquehanna. 5 minutes afterward, the whole town of San Francisco learned the news. Before 6 in the evening, the different states of the Union had heard the great catastrophe, and after midnight, by the cable, the whole of Europe knew the result of the great American experiment. We will not attempt to picture the effect produced on the entire world by that unexpected denouement. On receipt of the telegram, the Naval Secretary telegraphed to the Susquehanna to wait in the Bay of San Francisco without extinguishing her fires. Day and night, she must be ready to put to sea. The Cambridge Observatory called a special meeting, and with that composure which distinguishes learned bodies in general, peacefully discussed the scientific bearings of the question. At the Gun Club, there was an explosion. All the gunners were assembled. Vice President the Hun, Wilcome, was in the act of reading the premature dispatch, in which J.T. Maston and Belfast announced that the projectile had just been seen in the gigantic reflector of Long's Peak, and also that it was held by lunar attraction and was playing the part of under-satellite to the lunar world. We know the truth on that point. But on the arrival of Blomsberry's dispatch, so decidedly contradicting J.T. Maston's telegram, 2 parties were formed in the bosom of the Gun Club. On one side were those who admitted the fall of the projectile, and consequently the return of the travelers. On the other, those who believed in the observations of Long's Peak concluded that the commander of the Susquehanna had made a mistake. To the latter, the pretended projectile was nothing but a meteor, a shooting globe, which in its fall had smashed the bows of the corvette. It was difficult to answer this argument, for the speed with which it was animated must have made observation very difficult. The commander of the Susquehanna and her officers might have made a mistake in all good faith. One argument, however, was in their favor, namely, that if the projectile had fallen on the earth, its place of meeting with the terrestrial globe could only take place on this 27 degrees north latitude, and taking into consideration the time that had elapsed and the rotary motion of the earth between the 41 degrees and the 42 degrees of west longitude. In any case, it was decided in the Gun Club that Blomsberry brothers, Bilsby, and Major Elphinstone should go straight to San Francisco and consult as to the means of raising the projectile from the depths of the ocean. These devoted men set off at once, and the railroad, which will soon cross the whole of Central America, took them as far as St. Louis, where the swift mail coaches awaited them. Almost at the same moment in which the Secretary of Marine, the Vice President of the Gun Club, and the Subdirector of the Observatory received the dispatch from San Francisco, the Honorable J.T. Maston was undergoing the greatest excitement he had ever experienced in his life, an excitement which even the bursting of his pet gun, which had more than once nearly cost him his life, had not caused him. We may remember that the Secretary of the Gun Club had started soon after the projectile, and almost as quickly, for the station on Long's Peak in the Rocky Mountains, J. Belfast, director of the Cambridge Observatory, accompanying him. Arrived there, the two friends had installed themselves at once, never quitting the summit of their enormous telescope. We know that this gigantic instrument had been set up according to the reflecting system, called by the English front view. This arrangement subjected all objects to but one reflection, making the view consequently much clearer. The result was that, when they were taking observation, J.T. Maston and Belfast were placed in the upper part of the instrument and not in the lower, which they reached by a circular staircase, a masterpiece of lightness, while below them opened a metal well terminated by the metallic mirror, which measured 280 feet in depth. It was on a narrow platform placed above the telescope that the two savants passed their existence, execrating the day which hid the moon from their eyes, and the clouds which obstinately veiled her during the night. What then was their delight, when, after some days of waiting, on the night of the 5th of December, they saw the vehicle which was bearing their friends into space. To this delight succeeded a great deception, when, trusting to a cursory observation, they launched their first telegram to the world, erroneously affirming that the projectile had become a satellite of the moon, gravitating in an immutable orbit. From that moment, it had never shown itself to their eyes, a disappearance all the more easily explained, as it was then passing behind the moon's invisible disk. But when it was time for it to reappear on the visible disk, one may imagine the impatience of the fuming J.T. Maston and his not less impatient companion. Each minute of the night, they thought they saw the projectile once more, and they did not see it. Hence constant discussions and violent disputes between them, Belfast affirming that the projectile could not be seen, J.T. Maston maintaining that it had put his eyes out. "It is the projectile," repeated J.T. Maston. "No," answered Belfast, "it is an avalanche detached from a lunar mountain." "Well, we shall see it tomorrow." "No, we shall not see it any more. It is carried into space." "Yes." "No." And at these moments, when contradictions rained like hail, the well-known irritability of the Secretary of the Gun Club constituted a permanent danger for the Honorable Belfast. The existence of these two together would soon have become impossible, but an unforeseen event cut short their everlasting discussions. During the night, from the 14th to the 15th of December, the two irreconcilable friends were busy observing the lunar disk, J.T. Maston abusing the learned Belfast as usual, who was by his side, the Secretary of the Gun Club maintaining for the 1000th time that he had just seen the projectile, and adding that he could see Mitchell Arden's face looking through one of the scuttles, at the same time enforcing his argument by a series of gestures which his formidable hook rendered very unpleasant. At this moment, Belfast's servant appeared on the platform. It was 10 at night, and gave him a dispatch. It was the commander of the Susquehanna's telegram. Belfast tore the envelope and read, and uttered a cry. "What?" said J.T. Maston. "The projectile, well, has fallen to the earth." Another cry, this time a perfect howl, answered him. He turned toward J.T. Maston. The unfortunate man, imprudently leaning over the metal tube, had disappeared in the immense telescope. A fall of 280 feet. Belfast, dismayed, rushed to the orifice of the reflector. He breathed. J.T. Maston, caught by his metal hook, was holding on by one of the rings which bound the telescope together, uttering fearful cries. Belfast called, help was brought, tackle was let down, and they hoisted up, not without some trouble, the imprudent Secretary of the Gun Club. He reappeared at the upper orifice without hurt. "Ah," said he, "if I had broken the mirror." "You would have paid for it," replied Belfast severely. "And that cursed projectile has fallen?" asked J.T. Maston. "Into the Pacific. Let us go." A quarter of an hour after the two savants were descending the declivity of the Rocky Mountains, and 2 days after, at the same time as their friends of the Gun Club, they arrived at San Francisco, having killed 5 horses on the road. Elphinstone, the brothers Bloomsbury, and Bilsby rushed toward them on their arrival. "What shall we do?" they exclaimed. "Fish up the projectile," replied J.T. Maston, "and the sooner the better." Chapter 22. Recovered from the sea. The spot where the projectile sank under the waves was exactly known, but the machinery to grasp it and bring it to the surface of the ocean was still wanting. It must first be invented, then made. American engineers could not be troubled with such trifles. The grappling irons once fixed, by their help they were sure to raise it in spite of its weight, which was lessened by the density of the liquid in which it was plunged. But fishing up the projectile was not the only thing to be thought of. They must act promptly in the interest of the travelers. No one doubted that they were still living. "Yes," repeated J.T. Maston incessantly, whose confidence gained over everybody, "our friends are clever people, and they cannot have fallen like simpletons. They are alive, quite alive, but we must make haste if we wish to find them so. Food and water do not trouble me, they have enough for a long while, but air, that is what they will soon want, so quick, quick." And they did go quick. They fitted up the Susquehanna for her new destination. Her powerful machinery was brought to bear upon the hauling chains. The aluminum projectile only weighed 250 pounds, a weight very inferior to that of the transatlantic cable which had been drawn up under similar conditions. The only difficulty was in fishing up a cylindro-conical projectile, the walls of which were so smooth as to offer no hold for the hooks. On that account, Engineer Murchison hastened to San Francisco and had some enormous grappling irons fixed on an automatic system, which would never let the projectile go if it once succeeded in seizing it in its powerful claws. Diving dresses were also prepared, which through this impervious covering allowed the divers to observe the bottom of the sea. He also had put on board an apparatus of compressed air very cleverly designed. There were perfect chambers pierced with scuttles, which, with water let into certain compartments, could draw it down into great depths. These apparatuses were at San Francisco, where they had been used in the construction of a submarine breakwater, and very fortunately it was so, for there was no time to construct any. But in spite of the perfection of the machinery, in spite of the ingenuity of the savants entrusted with the use of them, the success of the operation was far from being certain. How great were the chances against them, the projectile being 20,000 feet under the water, and if even it was brought to the surface, how would the travelers have borne the terrible shock, which 20,000 feet of water had perhaps not sufficiently broken? At any rate, they must act quickly. J.T. Maston hurried the workmen day and night. He was ready to don the diving dress himself, or try the air apparatus, in order to reconnoiter the situation of his courageous friends. But in spite of all the diligence displayed in preparing the different engines, in spite of the considerable sum placed at the disposal of the Gun Club by the government of the Union, 5 long days, 5 centuries, elapsed before the preparations were complete. During this time, public opinion was excited to the highest pitch. Telegrams were exchanged incessantly throughout the entire world by means of wires and electric cables. The saving of Barbicane, Nicholl, and Mitchell Arden was an international affair. Everyone who had subscribed to the Gun Club was directly interested in the welfare of the travelers. At length the hauling chains, the air chambers, and the automatic grappling irons were put on board. J.T. Maston, Engineer Murchison, and the delegates of the Gun Club were already in their cabins. They had but to start, which they did on the 21st of December at 8 o'clock at night, the corvette meeting with a beautiful sea, a northeasterly wind, and rather sharp cold. The whole population of San Francisco was gathered on the quay, greatly excited but silent, reserving their hurrahs for the return. Steam was fully up, and the screw of the Susquehanna carried them briskly out of the bay. It is needless to relate the conversations on board between the officers, sailors, and passengers. All these men had but one thought. All these hearts beat under the same emotion. While they were hastening to help them, what were Barbicane and his companions doing? What had become of them? Were they able to attempt any bold maneuver to regain their liberty? None could say. The truth is that every attempt must have failed. Immersed nearly 4 miles under the ocean, this metal prison defied every effort of its prisoners. On the 23rd inst, at 8 in the morning, after a rapid passage, the Susquehanna was due at the fatal spot. They must wait till 12 to take the reckoning exactly. The buoy to which the sounding line had been lashed had not yet been recognized. At 12, Captain Blomsberry, assisted by his officers who superintended the observations, took the reckoning in the presence of the delegates of the Gun Club. Then there was a moment of anxiety. Her position decided, the Susquehanna was found to be some minutes westward of the spot where the projectile had disappeared beneath the waves. The ship's course was then changed so as to reach this exact point. At 47 minutes past 12, they reached the buoy. It was in perfect condition and must have shifted but little. At last, exclaimed J.T. Maston. "Shall we begin?" asked Captain Blomsberry. Without losing a second. Every precaution was taken to keep the corvette almost completely motionless. Before trying to seize the projectile, Engineer Murchison wanted to find its exact position at the bottom of the ocean. The submarine apparatus destined for this expedition was supplied with air. The working of these engines was not without danger, for at 20,000 feet below the surface of the water, and under such great pressure, they were exposed to fracture, the consequences of which would be dreadful. J.T. Maston, the brothers Blomsberry, and Engineer Murchison, without heeding these dangers, took their places in the air chamber. The commander, posted on his bridge, superintended the operation, ready to stop or haul in the chains on the slightest signal. The screw had been shipped, and the whole power of the machinery collected on the capstan would have quickly drawn the apparatus on board. The descent began at 25 minutes past 1 at night, and the chamber, drawn under by the reservoirs full of water, disappeared from the surface of the ocean. The emotion of the officers and sailors on board was now divided between the prisoners in the projectile and the prisoners in the submarine apparatus. As to the latter, they forgot themselves, and glued to the windows of the scuttles, attentively watched the liquid mass through which they were passing. The descent was rapid. At 17 minutes past 2, J.T. Maston and his companions had reached the bottom of the Pacific, but they saw nothing but an arid desert, no longer animated by either fauna or flora. By the light of their lamps, furnished with powerful reflectors, they could see the dark beds of the ocean for a considerable extent of view, but the projectile was nowhere to be seen. The impatience of these bold divers cannot be described, and having an electrical communication with the corvette, they made a signal already agreed upon, and for the space of a mile, the Susquehanna moved their chamber along some yards above the bottom. Thus they explored the whole submarine plain, deceived at every turn by optical illusions which almost broke their hearts. Here a rock, there a projection from the ground, seemed to be the much sought-for projectile, but their mistake was soon discovered, and then they were in despair. "But where are they? Where are they?" cried J.T. Maston, and the poor man called loudly upon Nicholl, Barbicane, and Mitchell Arden, as if his unfortunate friends could either hear or answer him through such an impenetrable medium. The search continued under these conditions until the vitiated air compelled the divers to ascend. The hauling in began about 6 in the evening and was not ended before midnight. "Tomorrow," said J.T. Maston, as he set foot on the bridge of the corvette. "Yes," answered Captain Blomsberry. "And on another spot." "Yes." J.T. Maston did not doubt of their final success, but his companions, no longer upheld by the excitement of the first hours, understood all the difficulty of the enterprise. What seemed easy at San Francisco seemed here in the wide ocean almost impossible. The chances of success diminished in rapid proportion, and it was from chance alone that the meeting with the projectile might be expected. The next day, the 24th, in spite of the fatigue of the previous day, the operation was renewed. The corvette advanced some minutes to westward, and the apparatus, provided with air, bore the same explorers to the depths of the ocean. The whole day passed in fruitless research. The bed of the sea was a desert. The 25th brought no other result, nor the 26th. It was disheartening. They thought of those unfortunates shut up in the projectile for 26 days. Perhaps at that moment they were experiencing the first approach of suffocation, that is, if they had escaped the dangers of their fall. The air was spent, and doubtless with the air all their morale. The air, possibly, answered J.T. Maston resolutely, but their morale never. On the 28th, after 2 more days of search, all hope was gone. This projectile was but an atom in the immensity of the ocean. They must give up all idea of finding it. But J.T. Maston would not hear of going away. He would not abandon the place without at least discovering the tomb of his friends. But Commander Bloomsbury could no longer persist, and in spite of the exclamations of the worthy secretary, was obliged to give the order to sail. On the 29th of December, at 9 a.m., the Susquehanna, heading northeast, resumed her course to the Bay of San Francisco. It was 10 in the morning. The corvette was under half steam, as it was regretting to leave the spot where the catastrophe had taken place, when a sailor, perched on the maintop-gallant crosstrees, watching the sea, cried suddenly, "A buoy on the lee-bow!" The officers looked in the direction indicated, and by the help of their glasses saw that the object signaled had the appearance of one of those buoys which are used to mark the passages of bays or rivers. But singularly to say, a flag floating on the wind surmounted its cone, which emerged 5 or 6 feet out of water. This buoy shone under the rays of the sun as if it had been made of plates of silver. Commander Bloomsbury, J.T. Maston, and the delegates of the Gun Club were mounted on the bridge, examining this object straying at random on the waves. All looked with feverish anxiety, but in silence. None dared give expression to the thoughts which came to the minds of all. The corvette approached to within 2 cables' lengths of the object. A shudder ran through the whole crew. That flag was the American flag. At this moment, a perfect howling was heard. It was the brave J.T. Maston who had just fallen all in a heap. Forgetting on the one hand that his right arm had been replaced by an iron hook, and on the other that a simple gutta-percha cap covered his brain box, he had given himself a formidable blow. They hurried toward him, picked him up, restored him to life. And what were his first words? "Ah, trebly brutes, quadruply idiots, quintuply boobies that we are." "What is it?" exclaimed everyone around him. "What is it? Come, speak." "It is, simpletons," howled the terrible secretary. "It is that the projectile only weighs 19,250 pounds. Well, and that it displaces 28 tons, or in other words 56,000 pounds, and that consequently it floats." Ah, what stress the worthy man had laid on the verb float. And it was true. All these savants had forgotten this fundamental law, namely, that on account of its specific lightness, the projectile, after having been drawn by its fall to the greatest depths of the ocean, must naturally return to the surface. And now it was floating quietly at the mercy of the waves. The boats were put to sea. J.T. Maston and his friends had rushed into them. Excitement was at its height. Every heart beat loudly while they advanced to the projectile. What did it contain? Living or dead? Living, yes. Living, at least unless death had struck Barbicane and his 2 friends since they had hoisted the flag. Profound silence reigned on the boats. All were breathless. Eyes no longer saw. One of the scuttles of the projectile was open. Some pieces of glass remained in the frame, showing that it had been broken. This scuttle was actually 5 feet above the water. A boat came alongside, that of J.T. Maston, and J.T. Maston rushed to the broken window. At that moment, they heard a clear and merry voice, the voice of Mitchell Arden, exclaiming in an accent of triumph, "White old Barbicane, white old." Barbicane, Mitchell Arden, and Nishal were playing at dominoes. Chapter 23. The End. We may remember the intense sympathy which had accompanied the travelers on their departure. If at the beginning of the enterprise they had excited such emotion both in the Old and New World, with what enthusiasm would they be received on their return? The millions of spectators which had beset the peninsula of Florida, would they not rush to meet these sublime adventurers? Those legions of strangers, hurrying from all parts of the globe toward the American shores, would they leave the Union without having seen Barbicane, Nishal, and Mitchell Arden? No. And the ardent passion of the public was bound to respond worthily to the greatness of the enterprise. Human creatures who had left the terrestrial sphere and returned after this strange voyage into celestial space could not fail to be received as the prophet Elias would be if he came back to earth. To see them first, and then to hear them, such was the universal longing. Barbicane, Mitchell Arden, Nishal, and the delegates of the Gun Club, returning without delay to Baltimore, were received with indescribable enthusiasm. The notes of President Barbicane's voyage were ready to be given to the public. The New York Herald bought the manuscript at a price not yet known, but which must have been very high. Indeed, during the publication of A Journey to the Moon, the sale of this paper amounted to 5 millions of copies. 3 days after the return of the travelers to the Earth, the slightest detail of their expedition was known. There remained nothing more but to see the heroes of this superhuman enterprise. The expedition of Barbicane and his friends round the moon had enabled them to correct the many admitted theories regarding the terrestrial satellite. These savants had observed de visu and under particular circumstances. They knew what systems should be rejected, what retained with regard to the formation of that orb, its origin, its habitability. Its past, present, and future had even given up their last secrets. Who could advance objections against conscientious observers, who at less than 24 miles distance had marked that curious mountain of Tycho, the strangest system of lunar orography? How answer those savants whose sight had penetrated the abyss of Pluto's circle? How contradict those bold ones whom the chances of their enterprise had borne over that invisible face of the disk, which no human eye until then had ever seen? It was now their turn to impose some limit on that selenographic science, which had reconstructed the lunar world as Cuvier did the skeleton of a fossil, and say, the moon was this, a habitable world, inhabited before the earth. The moon is that, a world uninhabitable and now uninhabited. To celebrate the return of its most illustrious member and his 2 companions, the Gun Club decided upon giving a banquet, but a banquet worthy of the conquerors, worthy of the American people, and under such conditions that all the inhabitants of the Union could directly take part in it. All the headlines of railroads in the States were joined by flying rails, and on all the platforms, lined with the same flags and decorated with the same ornaments, were tables laid and all served alike. At certain hours, successively calculated, marked by electric clocks which beat the seconds at the same time, the population were invited to take their places at the banquet tables. For 4 days, from the 5th to the 9th of January, the trains were stopped as they are on Sundays on the railways of the United States, and every road was open. One engine only at full speed, drawing a triumphal carriage, had the right of traveling for those 4 days on the railroads of the United States. The engine was manned by a driver and a stoker, and bore, by special favor, the Hun. J.T. Maston, Secretary of the Gun Club. The carriage was reserved for President Barbicane, Colonel Nishal, and Mitchell Arden. At the whistle of the driver, amid the hurrahs, and all the admiring vociferations of the American language, the train left the platform of Baltimore. It traveled at a speed of 160 miles in the hour. But what was this speed compared with that which had carried the 3 heroes from the mouth of the Columbiad? Thus they sped from one town to the other, finding whole populations at table on their road, saluting them with the same acclamations, lavishing the same bravos. They traveled in this way through the east of the Union, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire, the north and west by New York, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, returning to the south by Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana. They went to the southeast by Alabama and Florida, going up by Georgia and the Carolinas, visiting the center by Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and Indiana, and after quitting the Washington station, re-entered Baltimore, where for 4 days one would have thought that the United States of America were seated at one immense banquet, saluting them simultaneously with the same hurrahs. The apotheosis was worthy of these three heroes, whom fable would have placed in the rank of demigods. And now will this attempt, unprecedented in the annals of travels, lead to any practical result? Will direct communication with the moon ever be established? Will they ever lay the foundation of a traveling service through the solar world? Will they go from one planet to another, from Jupiter to Mercury, and after a while from one star to another, from the polar to Sirius? Will this means of locomotion allow us to visit those suns which swarm in the firmament? To such questions, no answer can be given. But knowing the bold ingenuity of the Anglo-Saxon race, no one would be astonished if the Americans seek to make some use of President Barbicane's attempt. Thus, sometime after the return of the travelers, the public received with marked favor the announcement of a company, limited, with a capital of $100 million, divided into 100,000 shares of $1,000 each, under the name of the National Company of Interstellary Communication. President, Barbicane; Vice President, Captain Nicholl; Secretary, J.T. Maston; Director of Movements, Mitchell Arden. And as it is part of the American temperament to foresee everything in business, even failure, the Honorable Harry Trollope, Judge Commissioner, and Francis Drayton, Magistrate, were nominated beforehand. The end.